Social media corporations are inherently profit-seeking entities that are not accountable to the public and thus should not be able to control governmental social media accounts. Such control allows corporations to mediate the relationship between the government and the people, and by doing so, undermine democracy as a whole. As more and more governmental agencies and elected officials use sites like Twitter to communicate with the public, the potential consequences of intervention have dramatically increased. For example, Donald Trump's Twitter account, the de facto channel of communication between the presidency and the people, was permanently suspended in January of 2021. Although the grounds for this ban were valid, it sets a dangerous precedent of corporate intervention between the presidency and the people. In order to solve this problem, legislation that regulates governmental social media accounts must be passed by elected officials. This will place power back into the hands of the people and remove corporations as undemocratic middlemen.
Disinformation is spreading rampant in digital spaces, as algorithms push content and information based on users' subjective preferences, which creates an environment of skepticism and doubt, and drowns out truth and credibility. The spread of politicized disinformation threatens democratic societies, and must be addressed by both governments and tech companies through policies that focus on the protection of truth. One solution is for governments and companies to cooperate in creating legislation that mitigates and counters disinformation. These policies might involve the use of AI systems that detect and flag disinformation, and also remove bots and troll accounts from spreading more fake news. Companies must also do their part by enforcing the rules on their platforms, promoting credible sources of information, and cooperating with relevant agencies by providing data and monitoring the sources of disinformation. It is important for both governments and companies to cooperate in countering disinformation if we are to protect truth in democracies.
Thank you so much to the Global Liberal Art Alliance students for their fantastic videos that they're producing. I'm Max Strasser. I'm a senior editor with the opinion section of the New York Times based in London, and we're now going to begin our panel on disinformation's black hole. This is a topic I think about a lot. I think as a journalist, it's very important to me personally, but I think as we think about our subject's resilience and renewal of democracy, a renewed and a resilient democracy is going to rely on good information from academics, good information from the media, and it has to be trusted. And so, you know, as we think about how to strengthen our democracy, we have to think about how to inform our citizens. I'm joined today by a really fantastic panel. Digitally with us today, we have Maria Ressa. She is the co-founder and CEO of Rappler. Christophe Deloire, he is the executive director of Reporters Without Borders. Here in Athens with me is Stephen King, the CEO of Luminate, and Irene Braam. She is the executive director of the Bertelsmann Foundation. It's a really all-star panel to discuss this very important topic. And I want to jump right in with a question for Maria, if we have her here with us. But I'm not seeing her at the moment. Oh, Maria, hello. I'm so sorry you can't be with us in Athens today. I'm afraid we don't have you on audio right now.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
There you are. So good to see you.
Yes, it's so nice to see you guys, and how I wish I was there with you. I had my flights booked. I was about to get on a flight 24 hours before. I received word from the court. So, you know, the Philippine government filed 10 arrest warrants against me in less than 2 years. 2 cases have been dismissed in the last few months. But in order to travel, I have to get approval from the courts, the judges that are holding the 7 remaining charges. I got approval from 6, was denied on the 1. So this is the 4th time that this government has prevented me from traveling, has taken away my rights. But, you know, we keep going, and here we are. I'm really glad to be with you, even virtually.
I'm glad you're here, too. I mean, you've been doing so much important work on journalism, freedom of the press, and disinformation. I want to start with a sort of general question. You know, I think we've been talking a lot about disinformation, especially for the last 6-7 years, since President Trump was elected in the United States and since President Duterte was elected in the Philippines. Do you think we're in a better place today than we were 5 or 6 years ago when it comes to disinformation?
Absolutely not. It's worse. It may look like it's better from the United States because Joe Biden won the presidency, but that was because you had all the social media platforms go all hands on deck with their break glass initiatives, right? That's not going to happen for every single election around the world. The same systems are still there. The surveillance capitalism that allows lies laced with anger and hate to spread faster and further than facts. This is a major problem, right? And when you don't have facts, when facts are debatable, that's the core problem, then you can't have truth, you can't have trust, you certainly can't have democracy if you don't have facts, truth, and trust. You also cannot have a shared reality because the design of the social media platform, all of them, they all use an algorithm for each of us to grow our platforms using friends of friends. And what happened in the Philippines, just like what happened in the United States in 2016 when President Duterte won, we weren't debating the facts. We were all here in the middle. But over time, what happened? If you were pro-Duterte, you move further right. If you're anti-Duterte, you move further left. That's 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. And here's the last part, right? As we've seen from January 6th, this is like unleashing a virus of lies in our information ecosystem. I became a journalist because I believe information is power and will lead to justice. Well, what if you don't have the right information? This is the way authoritarians come in, dictatorships are grown, and how democracy dies.
So I think you've gotten at the most crucial question, which is how do we establish facts, truth, and trust, right? Christophe, I know you've been doing a lot of work on this subject. Tell me, what do you think the next first step needs to be to reestablish facts, truth, and trust? Oh, I'm afraid we can't hear you at this moment also. Maybe we can get you... Irene, what do you think? How do we establish facts, truth, and trust?
Well, I think what we should, for me, a part where we should focus on is how do we educate the younger population, what Maria said, how can you basically make the distinction in between truth and false information. And I think it is misinformation and disinformation is an extremely complex issues. There are a lot of actors in play. Yeah. Are you going to regulate the platforms? Are we not going to regulate the platforms? Do we hold our political leaders accountable for sometimes the false information they intentionally spread? For me, an important part is, we need to get into the curriculums of our schools a kind of media literacy, digital literacy, I would call them digital hygiene classes. And not only explaining the younger people on how this social media or online media landscape looks, but also, who are the traditional players? And I just want to give you an example. The son of friends of mine said to me, Irene, I'm following this cool news channel on Twitter called RT. And I told him, do you know who RT is, for what it stands for? And he said, no. So I think it already starts there, kind of creating some kind of transparency on who the players are.
But if we're starting with young people, that means we're talking about a long-term project, right?
Yes.
Well, we have immediate issues with this right now. So Stephen, I'm curious what you think. Like, when it comes to, say, the tech platforms, what do we need to do right now while we're also training a new generation of media literate citizens?
Yeah, I think if we had any doubt about the uncontrolled power of the tech platforms, we just need to look at the last couple of weeks of the revelations through the Facebook files, through the Wall Street Journal. That's explosive, and it also points very clearly at the uncontrolled element of tech platforms.
Do you think they claim that they want to be regulated? They claim that they want to regulate themselves, that they're looking for legislation. This is a question for all of you I'm interested in. Do you believe them? Do you think we can trust them?
No.
No.
Christophe, do we have you?
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine. No, we cannot trust them. We cannot just give the keys of democracies to digital platforms on social networks. What we have to do as citizens of democracies is to implement democratic safeguards into the digital space. And what we need now is a bit like the equivalent of the international process for the climate change. And that's why last Friday, we were with Maya, we had a summit on information and democracy organized in New York City with dozens of foreign ministers, heads of international organizations, to really promote a framework where democratic countries impose democratic principles to digital platforms and social networks. We cannot just deal with symptoms, and disinformation is a symptom. Rumors are symptoms. Hate speech is a symptom. The causes is the destruction of the system of safeguards, of democratic safeguards. The world, the ancient world, that was never perfect. We had constitutional guarantee according to countries' media regulation. We have journalistic ethics and methods, and this system of safeguards has been swept away. We had to create a new one, adapted to the digital era, and that's what we are doing at Reporters Without Borders with many others, with dozens of other organizations now, with Initiative on Information Democracy. We have now secured a partnership with 43 signatory countries.
Do you worry that if we start legislating, I mean, you know, the claim you're going to hear, this is a claim you hear on the right a lot, or on the sort of disinformation right a lot, is that this is a free speech issue. That once you start legislating disinformation, you're somehow doing the opposite of creating a more open discourse. You're restricting it. I mean, Stephen, do you think that that's a concern? And how do we guard against the claim that we are?
Yeah, that is a concern. And I think we've seen, you know, in many countries, this idea of regulation to stop fake news. So and this is, you know, a thinly disguised way of imposing censorship on free speech. So I think we've got to be very careful as we go into legislation that we're not imposing controls on free speech. But I think we've also got to recognize that the terms of service, if you like, the surveillance capitalism that Maria mentioned earlier on, has changed entirely the way in which disinformation and misinformation is spread. We've always had hate speech. We've always had opposing views or hate-filled rhetoric, but it's been on the margins. Now what you've got is a business model that amplifies this without control, and that's what needs regulating.
But we also have politicians who amplify this without control, right? I mean, Maria, you know as much about this as anyone else. I mean, what do we do? How do we guard against the idea of fake news being weaponized by someone like Rodrigo Duterte or Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin?
You can't, as long as the design of social media stays the way it is. You know, you asked, is this a free speech issue? It is not a free speech issue. It's a distribution issue, right? The world's largest distributor of news globally is actually biased against facts, biased against journalists. You know what we do as journalists just is not going to spread as fast as the salacious lie that makes people angry. Surveillance capitalism, which underlies social media, has led to insidious manipulation that has destroyed trust and our shared reality. And what I mean by that are information operations by the Internet Research Agency, the GRU in Russia. You know that that's now documented hitting the 2016 elections. Americans were the target. Here in the Philippines, Facebook has done takedowns. Most recently, September last year, and this was interesting, they took down an influence operation, information operations from China. It was doing three things. The first was creating fake accounts using AI-generated photos for the US presidential election. So this was September last year. The second thing it was doing was campaigning for the daughter of President Duterte, Sara Duterte, for our May 2022 elections. And the third thing it was doing was attacking me and Rappler, right? These are information operations. You cannot. This is where the legislation needs to come in. There must be accountability. Look, when Rappler, in 2016, I wrote a piece called How Facebook Algorithms Impact Democracy, 2016. And what we've seen from that time is it's just truly gotten worse and has been exploited by the global geopolitical power players. We would like to think it doesn't happen, but it does.
Well, do you think that there's any possibility that we're we're assigning too much blame to these platforms. I mean, maybe the traditional media also has failed in some ways in its responsibilities to inform the public, to create trust and credibility. I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, what do you think? Christophe, do you think that's possible?
Sure, media outlets have to think about their own responsibilities, why they did lose the trust of citizens, of some part of the citizens. But we have a pluralism of media outlets. Platforms are now structuring entities. They do create infrastructure of our public space. And Stefan said something very important. Now the public space is governed by private interests, by business interests. And it is not democracy in this regard. So this is why we have to avoid that we just platforms on social networks replace our parliaments. Our laws in the past, they were transparent, they were adopted with checks and balances, they were adopted by parliaments. Now the laws, code is law, you know, and the laws of the public space are adopted by platforms. So it's very important that democracies put a framework, that we find very concrete mechanism to give a competitive advantage to good journalism, to editorial independence, to ethical rules, to verification methods, all professional methods. And this is also the purpose of the Journalism Trust initiative we launched, which is a market solution to reverse the logic. The logic today, unfortunately, is that falsehood, rumors, insults have a sort of competitive advantage in the digital space. We have to reverse this, and we also have to reverse the competitive advantage that despotic regimes enjoy in the global information and communication space, because they just succeed to spread, circulate propaganda, to close and control news and information internally. This is unfair competition. Democracies could just be destroyed by this. We have to resist and to fight back.
So a lot of us are talking about sort of regulation of one form or another. That's going to require some political will. Do you think that political will?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think, you know, what is lacking and what has been lacking is the political will. Maria just mentioned, referred back to 2015, but I can remember even going back to 2010 when the first cases were brought forward against Google by the news industry in Europe. And what has happened? Basically, nothing has changed. And I think we are now kind of in an environment where political leaders basically manipulate, they use these platforms for their own political gain. So I think even there, the political will kind of diminish further.
Do you think that serious regulation has to begin in the United States because that's where these companies are based for the most part?
Well, I think anyway, it needs to be an international conversation. Yeah. You know, they have global reach. You cannot kind of, you know, there's not kind of an online border which you can open and close. But I think we have lost too much time.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think regulation needs to be worldwide, but I think it's more likely that it's going to happen in the European Union. I think the legislative environment and the regulatory environment with GDPR and so on is a more permissive environment. And there are the opportunities for class action cases and so on, which I think will start to make a difference. I think trying to start in the US is much more problematic because of the protections offered to big tech companies, and I think a reluctance from the US administration to try and constrain those tech companies.
Do you think that, Maria, this is a question for you, I guess. Do you worry that if we do start to regulate these tech platforms much better, that there's going to be global inequalities? That maybe in Europe there will be an enforcement of regulation, and then you look at countries in the global south, and we're not going to see the platforms really pay as much attention to the issues going on there.
It's always been the case. I expect it to continue being the case, but it's like the entire world, with the West setting the trend, has veered off in the wrong path, and it's dragging the global south where this wrong path is, that is essentially breaking down trust, right? But we have far less protections because our institutions are so much weaker. Look, I think that regulation is imperative. I am a Facebook partner. You know, we're one of two Filipino fact-checking partners here, and we continue to work with Facebook, with Google, with all the tech platforms. I believe tech is going to be part of the future. But what you are seeing right now, and this is where it's not a free speech issue, this is where when the gatekeeping power shifted from journalists to tech, they took the money, but they left behind the gatekeeping role, which is to keep the public safe. And that's what needs to get legislated back, right? It cannot be surveillance capitalism, i.e. money at all costs. We've certainly seen exponential reach. I think the last part that we haven't mentioned is that women, journalists, human rights activists, opposition women politicians in particular, especially in countries like mine where there are information operations attacking them, trying to pound them to silence, these are the victims. And some protection needs to be put in place for people like me. There's an UNESCO report that came out in May that just showed, right, out of almost 500,000 attacks against me, 60% were meant to tear down credibility, 40% to tear down my will to fight back.
What do you think that? You talked about how the gatekeeping powers have shifted, how traditional media has lost the gatekeeping powers. Do you think even if we do legislate, even if we do find ways to regulate tech companies, that we're going to regain, people like the New York Times are going to regain those gatekeeping powers on truth, or is that lost forever? Christophe?
Lost forever.
Lost forever. What do you, Christophe, lost forever?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no, please, go ahead, continue.
No, I will not deal with the threat of the future of this media or this other one, but what we have to rebuild is the social function of journalism, and to secure this. And for this, we need to consider that journalists are like, or should be, trusted parties of societies, of and gives some incentives to those who impose to themselves processes which are important for the prosperity of use of information. The Forum on Information and Democracy recently called for a new deal for journalism to really create the conditions for this social function to survive. The Forum on Information and Democracy, which we created, is a civil society-led implementation body of this partnership, intergovernmental partnership on information democracy, which was signed. And we announced last Friday that, according to the example of the climate change process, we will create an observatory on information democracy, which will be the equivalent of the IPCC, will be co-chaired by Angel Goria, former Secretary General of OECD, and Shoshana Zuboff, author of the best-selling book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. We create a new working group on the accountability of social media accounts, and there will be, from now on, annual summits on information democracy. We really enter into something with more political will and what we need to the vision. Because the question is not just should we regulate or have a responsibility for platforms. The question is exactly what type of responsibility, how do we do this to avoid that we are bad regulation, because of course regulation can also be bad, but we have to secure is a proper one.
Stephen, what do you think? Do we need a new deal for journalism?
Yeah, we do. I think part of the puzzle of restoring trust is threefold. We talked about control of social media. There's also a job to be done to restore trust in government as well. Government has a role to play in that. But I think that we also need to support independent journalism. Brave investigative journalists like Maria and Rappler and others around the world are the last bastion of checks and balances against the authoritarians. Maria has agreed to join us as co-chair of a new initiative called the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which we are launching soon, and a number of different philanthropies are behind. The most important thing there is to bring in new resources to provide support for beleaguered radio stations, newspapers, digital platforms, and so to help them continue to do their work.
But, so this is, I mean, aren't we kind of talking about a business problem? I mean, as Maria said, the platforms have taken all of the money that used to keep the media alive. I mean, do we think that in the long term, a publicly funded model is going to be sustainable, is going to really be able to bulwark that we need to keep our democracies healthy?
It's one part of the solution. It's not going to be the full part. You're not going to have a BBC in every country.
Yeah.
You know, so what you've got to think about is how do you provide that very basic level of sustainability. But then, of course, there's subscription models, there's membership, there's a whole range of other things which will help to sustain this in the future.
Can I add something onto what Stephen said? I mean, I'm a big believer in public service news media, public service broadcasters. And if you look at the European landscape, where we still have a lot of very good public service broadcasters, their funding has been kind of diminished and undercutted in the years. And they also start to look more like private broadcasters. So if you look at their programming, because they are kind of competing for the little eyeballs that are still watching the television. So I think also there we need to invest, and you know, that people have at least one entry point where they can get reliable information. I don't know how you will get the younger generation back to those traditional media outlets, because I mean, their access to information, any kind of information, is their smartphone.
Is there not a way that we can, I mean, I just wonder if there's a way that traditional media can learn to adapt to the smartphone era. I mean, obviously this is something we're all thinking about a lot, those of us who work in the media.
Yeah, but then it's behind paywall. And I don't want to say that that's not good, because it's very good that you have the two. You know, there needs to be a sustainable business model. I absolutely understand that. But of course, an 18-year-old will probably not have enough money to have a subscription to the New York Times.
Yeah. Maria, do you think public funding is the way to go?
It's the interim solution, right? Look, when you're talking about, I'm a traditional journalist. I grew up, this is 35th year as a journalist, and when we created Rappler in 2012, it was precisely to go to where the younger generation is, right? We have 3 pillars, and this is our solution. And you know, it's fantastic because I work with both Stephen and Christophe. Technology, with the Forum on Information and Democracy, we authored a long paper that we released November last year on the infodemics. How do you stop it? How do you find systemic solutions to tax problems, right? This is the distribution problem of news. How do you stop tearing down trust? The second pillar is journalism. And this is working with the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is to try to find a multilateral solution. An atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem. This is an interim measure until news organizations can find the next business model, which, here's the third part, community, right? So those are our 3 pillars. The reason we survived the attacks of the Duterte administration is because of our community. And guess what? Like, we've actually made more money, because when the Duterte administration attacked us, they scared away our advertisers. In January 2018, they tried to shut us down. By April, I lost 49% of our advertising. And so we went into this kind of like emergency mode, and we looked for an alternative, sustainable business model, and we found it in how we were looking at disinformation networks. And you realize that the problem of trust is the problem of advertising, it's the problem of every company and every individual around the world.
Christophe, do you think community has an important role to play? I mean, do you think there's community funding models are going to work, or do you think it's going to maybe contribute to more polarization, to lead us towards a more atomized media landscape?
No, I think it is very important that there is a balance between different types of business models. What is important is to work at different levels. Let's compare to a game. We need to have good players. Our media outlets have to be as good players as possible, but we need good rules of the game, because we can have good players. The rules of the game are crazy.
When leaders fail to lead, the people will lead and make them follow.
Perhaps
are we
like to watch this game.
Sorry, we had a bit of a technical issue at the last minute, so I lost the end of what you were saying, but we're sort of getting close to the end of our session. I did want to take the opportunity to open it up for questions from the audience, because I think we've got such an interesting and special panel here that I want to make sure the audience gets to ask them what they want to hear. Please, ma'am in the blue dress, there's a microphone coming your way just now.
You mentioned that you say that you don't trust the youth to regulate themselves on this topic. However, it seems that those that are most vulnerable and susceptible to the disinformation are the older generations that are less familiar with navigating the internet. And I know that Facebook, at least I'm speaking of the American political climate, I know that Facebook is a big perpetrator of this, and I don't know, I was wondering if you guys have any specific actions maybe on educating the older generations on this topic, considering that they contribute to a very large portion of the voter turnout in American society.
It's an interesting question. Irene, you were mentioning education. Do you think we need to be educating the older folks too?
Yeah, I think she's absolutely right. You know, I didn't add it, but I fully agree with it. We did an exercise with the American University last year with their online radicalization and polarization lab, and it was on fake news circulating on YouTube and how it has a potential of radicalizing youth. And in the end of our exercise, we basically came to the conclusion that we should not only target with educational programs these young people, but their parents. Because they were mostly not aware. So I don't have the perfect solution here, right? But I absolutely agree with what you said.
Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some governments have started to do this through civic literacy and civic education classes. Finland, for example, now has a whole series across the country where they engage people on civic and media literacy, really understanding some of the dangers of misinformation and disinformation. Now, those are long-term, expensive projects, and something, Finland maybe has the resources to do that. Trying to do that at a global basis is going to be very challenging, but I do think there is a sort of kernel of hope there in terms of civic literacy and media literacy as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know. I agree. I mean, I think it seems really important. I also agree that it seems like a very long-term solution to a very immediate problem is the only problem with talking about media literacy. Let's take a question now from the front.
Is it working? Yeah.
It's working. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Neshka Kladir-Mihailovic. I'm the Secretary General of Europa Nostra, cultural heritage organization, but I would like to ask a question as somebody who was born and raised in Belgrade, so the Western Balkans, and on following very much with great concern the alarming state of sort of media capture in my native country, Serbia, and a number of other countries. At the same time, 3 days ago, Ursula von der Leyen goes and make a tour in the Balkans, applauds the developments in these countries, and signs all sorts of agreements for support for economic development and for construction of highways and railways. Why is it so that the international community, and in particularly the West, the United States and the European Union, is not giving much more importance and investing more in independent media, in media literacy? Because this is the key for the democratization, true democratization of these areas, and ultimately for security, not just for this region, but for entire sort of Europe widely and the West in general. So there is, we at least experience sort of much more investing in sort of other economic areas where Western companies can also have lucrative businesses, but why not more in independent media?
It's a good question. Christophe, I wonder if you want to answer this, because you're talking also about some of these funding structures. Why do you think Western governments are not investing more in information literacy and media?
I think they want to do more, Oscar von der Leyen or Jourova, the Vice President of the European Commission, they do deal more with journalism now, especially after journalists, especially investigative journalists, were killed on the European soil. But of course, they have to do more. And clearly, we have a leverage effect. I met 3 years ago with the president of Serbia, then president of Bulgaria. They are very sensitive, for instance, to the ranking of the country in the World Press Freedom Index. So it gives a leverage effect to officials of the European Union. They should really use it, and you can count on us to do our best so that they do this.
Max, I think we also need to call a dog a dog. I don't know, but when the Arab Spring was happening, all these political leaders sitting in the beautiful buildings in Brussels were kind of yahooing and going to Egypt and saying, Facebook is bringing democracy to the Middle East.
Yeah.
So, Sneska, to reply to your question, that is also basically when the interest to fund independent media in these countries stopped, and also in the European neighboring countries.
And do you think it's an inability to admit the mistake, or what?
I think there's kind of part of hypocrisy. So, yeah, I would say yes.
That's a polite way to put it. We have a question here from the student delegates at the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. And one of them asks, many countries, for instance, the United States, have laws that prohibit the government from censoring information, including online disinformation, and therefore cannot pass laws that would neatly solve the misinformation problem. What are ways disinformation policies can work around such limitations and still be enforceable? That's a good, important question from our student delegates. I'm going to open that up. Does anyone want to take on this question of free speech laws and regulation? It's a subject we've been discussing.
Can I quickly just jump in?
Please.
Do you mind? Just on so I think part of what we need to shift in terms of the public dialogue is this idea that it is a free speech issue or that it is the user's fault. It's neither of those are true, right? So an American biologist, C.E.O. Wilson, actually encapsulated the problem we are all facing. He said that the crisis today comes from our, E.O. Wilson said, Paleolithic emotions, so we're being manipulated, medieval institutions that don't understand how we are being manipulated at scale, and finally, the last one is godlike technology. Social media has gotten such power, this godlike technology, behavior modification system. So when you look at laws, look at distribution. It isn't a free speech issue. It isn't something we need to be worried about. In fact, the people who are advocating free speech are the ones that are losing free speech because we are being pounded to silence. So the first step is stop surveillance capitalism. And you've heard this from people like Shoshana Zuboff, who basically says that our data in this extractive industry of surveillance capitalism is being used to create models of us that is through machine learning, and then artificial intelligence comes in and feeds our most vulnerable moment to a message. We're insidiously manipulated. That needs to stop.
Should we break up the platforms? What do you guys think?
I think ultimately, I mean, there's been discussion around, the monopolies and so on. I think the platforms are going to fight that with every legal tool they have. So I think it's unrealistic to expect the platforms to be broken up. Plus also then you have a kind of atomization of lots of different smaller platforms. I think regulation of platforms, whether there are 5 or 10 or 100, is the important solution.
That seems sensible to me. I'm afraid we have run out of time, unfortunately, but I want to give a round of applause to our wonderful panel, to Maria, to Christophe, to Stephen, Irene. I think that was really an interesting, fascinating, important conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us digitally. Now, here in Athens, we're going to head into a 20-minute coffee break. Get up, stretch your legs. 15-minute coffee break. Get up and stretch your legs, have a cup of coffee, and when we'll come back, we'll be talking about democratization, fast and slow. Thank you so much.